I'd like to start out just by getting to know you a little bit, because this is my first time at Hacktivity. How many of you are at your first Hacktivity? Nice. Okay, great. And how many of you are from outside of Hungary? Excellent. How many of you have been to cons outside of Hungary? Okay. And let's see, how many of you think of yourselves as hackers? Okay, that's an interesting one. How many of you call yourselves hackers when you're talking to family and friends? I wasn't sure if that number would be bigger or smaller. I didn't. How many of you have spoken at a conference before? Interesting. And how many of you have volunteered at a conference? Okay. Now, I'm one of a few people in the room who raise my hand every single time, because I can honestly answer yes to all of those questions. This is my first Hacktivity, and it's my first time in Budapest. It's my first time in Hungary. And one of the things that sometimes happens when I go to a new country that I've never been to before, and I'm invited to give a talk, sometimes somebody from the local media wants to ask me a few questions. And one of the questions that I often get, and maybe there's somebody here today who's planning to ask me this question, is something like this: how do Hungarian hackers compare to hackers in the rest of the world? The local media often wants to know that. And the first time I was asked that question by a local reporter from some country, it was a little bit surprising to me. I didn't know how to answer it, but I've learned over time how I should answer that question. And the way that I answer that question is this: I see hackers as a global community. I don't perceive Hungarian hackers to be different than hackers from any other country. To me, the hacker community is a very special community, and personally, as a hacker, I feel that I have more in common with hackers from other countries than I have in common with non-hackers from my own country. And I suspect a number of you here today can understand that feeling and can share that feeling. Even if you don't consider yourself a hacker, I bet you understand what I mean. And I want to talk about the hacker community today and what is special to me about this community, and hopefully what will be special to you about this community going forward. Because now that may be different than what is special to me, and that's okay. But I use the word community a lot, and sometimes people question that. When people ask me about the work that I do, for those of you who don't know me very well, my name is Michael Ossmann, and I'm the founder and owner of Great Scott Gadgets, which is an open source hardware company in Colorado, USA. And we are known for HackRF and Ubertooth and GreatFET, and these hardware projects that enable people to interact with technologies, and especially with communication systems, in new and interesting ways. And I've been a part of the hacker community for a long time, which is how I ended up here today. And I think it's important to remember, for me it's important to remember that it took me a long time before I really felt part of the community. And I suspect that some of you today are kind of in a place where I was 10 years ago or so, where maybe you're just getting into the community, or maybe you've kind of been a hacker for a long time, but you don't really call yourself a hacker. Maybe you don't really feel a part of the community yet. It took me a long time before I felt a part of the community. So I want to talk about community and what that word means and what the community means to me. Sometimes when I talk to people about my work, I refer to the hacker community, or I refer to the information security community, which is an overlapping concept. I say that I build tools for the information security community. And oftentimes people from outside the community question that use of the word community. They say, "Don't you mean industry?" And I say, "No, I don't mean industry, because many of the people who use my products, many of the people who take advantage of my educational materials, many of the people that I interact with in the community are not really a part of a single industry. They're people with diverse interests who happen to share an interest in creative solutions to technical problems." And so if you're somebody who enjoys coming up with creative solutions to technical problems, then I would consider you a hacker. I think that's a fairly broad view of the word hacker, but that's my view of the word hacker, and maybe it isn't even broad enough. Maybe I could broaden that even more, because I think the hacker community is really a set of people who share a certain spirit, a certain interest in creative technical weirdness. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit about how I came to feel part of this community, because it's so important to me, and maybe that can help some of you as you have a future in this community. Now, when I was a child, I used to play with computers a lot. I really liked computers and what you could do with them, and finding new ways, at least new to me, to make them do things was very exciting. And I didn't really think of myself as a hacker at the time, but I played with things like cracking copy protection on floppy disks. And I wasn't particularly good at it, but I had some success. And I shared floppy disks with people, with other kids in my neighborhood, and every now and then I would crack some piece of software and share it with them, and they would crack things and share it with me. And I'd heard about people who had things like modems and would explore computer systems that maybe they weren't supposed to. I kind of thought of those people as hackers, and I didn't really see myself as one of them. It wasn't for many years later that I started to kind of identify as a hacker myself. It wasn't until I was an adult and I was working in the IT industry that I kind of realized that I had things in common with other people that I was meeting online, some of whom were in the IT industry and some weren't, but many were. And I kind of started to identify with this hacker community a little bit, but I didn't really feel part of it. I just felt like I was a hacker, but I wasn't really a part of the hacker community. And the first time I went to a hacker conference was approximately 16, 17 years ago. I don't even remember the exact year, but it was a small conference called Rubicon in Detroit, Michigan. And this conference only lasted maybe 3 years, and I happened to be there the last year. It was a very eye-opening experience. It was full of young people, and it was a very rambunctious group. There were a lot of things going on at that conference that probably should not have been going on at that conference. There were a lot of shenanigans, let's say, and quite a bit of hacking of the infrastructure of the hotel that was hosting the conference. There were elevators doing interesting things, and the information systems of the hotel were attacked in various interesting ways. People were not really being very neighborly, in my opinion. And I felt a bit taken aback. These were not people who were behaving in quite the way that I wanted to be associated with, but they were doing really interesting things that I found fascinating and fun. As it turned out, on the last day of the conference, I think it was only a 2-day conference, at the end of the last day of the conference, we had a closing plenary session, and it was very brief. As the organizer of the conference stood up in front of everybody, and the police followed him in with a rather large force of police officers and dogs, and it was a very imposing force who stood in front of the room, and the organizer of the conference said, "We're being kicked out, everybody leave right now." And that was the last of Rubicon. That was my first conference experience, and it was very strange. But as I ended up at the airport much earlier than I expected, I got to know some of the other people who were at the conference, who were also waiting around for their flights that were much later in the day. And I started to get a feeling for how wonderful some of these people were. And they weren't all kids who were up to no good. They were wonderful, supportive people who had a community that I started to just get a tiny little feeling for was maybe a community that I wanted to be a part of. But it wasn't until a few years later that I started going to hacker conferences more regularly and started to truly feel a part of the community. And I think that when I did finally feel part of the community, it was when I started contributing, when I started sharing my own work, when I started speaking at conferences, when I started volunteering to help out at conferences, when I contributed, when I gave something from myself. That's when I really started to feel that I was getting something back and that I was really a part of this wonderful group of people, as it turns out. Now, the community is global, and I truly believe that we have a special community of hackers throughout the world. And one of the things that makes us global is that we're kind of defined by the way we interact with technology. And technology is more or less the same all around the world. And what really matters is kind of how we approach technology, our curiosity, our creativity, our skepticism. Does this thing really work the way they say it works? How does it really work? If you share that skepticism, then you're probably a part of this hacker community, whether you realize it or not. And we are linked to one another by online communication. And that's very significant, I think. Generations past, it was very difficult for people in the United States and people in Hungary, for example, to communicate with one another. It was something that was done only with great difficulty and over long periods of time. And today we can instantaneously communicate with people in almost any country in the world. And oftentimes we have conversations with people online without even knowing what country they're in. I find that amazing. And so we have created a global hacker community, whether we intended to or not, because of the way that we are linked by the internet. And as an example of that, I want to tell you about how I met my friend Dominic. Dominic Spill was somebody who lived in the United Kingdom, and I lived in the United States. We lived an ocean apart from each other. And I was learning software-defined radio, and interested in ways that it could be applied to various wireless communication technologies and security research of wireless communication technologies and monitoring of wireless communication technologies. And one of the technologies I looked at was Bluetooth. And I said, I would like to find a better way to monitor Bluetooth networks. There is, of course, a long history of wonderful tools for monitoring and doing the investigation and security testing of Wi-Fi networks, but there weren't good tools for Bluetooth, and I thought that was something that software-defined radio could change. So I became interested in Bluetooth, and I started looking into how I might build a Bluetooth monitor out of software-defined radio technology. And one of the first things I found was that there was this paper that had been written the year before by Dominic Spill and his advisor, who sadly died in a motorcycle wreck a couple of years ago. But Dominic was a person who had done some work and written a paper describing exactly the first step that I envisioned in my research. And I said, this is great. This is a starting point for me. And I emailed Dominic and I said, hey, I'm starting to investigate this, and I have these ideas, and I see that you've already done steps A, B, and C, and I want to take it further. Can we share some source code? Can we collaborate? And he immediately responded positively, and we started working together and collaborating over email, having never met each other in person, just because we were interested in the same technical problem. And it was only maybe 3 months later that Dominic and I gave our first conference presentation together at ShmooCon in the United States. This was January of 2009, or February, I can't remember. But the day that I met Dominic in person for the first time was the day before our talk at the conference. And I met Dominic, and we had been collaborating with each other for months and doing all of this work together, writing software, experimenting. And we finally got to meet each other in person, and I immediately said, let's go up to my hotel room and work on a talk. And he's fond of telling people that he met this strange man on the internet who immediately invited him up to his hotel room. And I guess that's not the only time I've done that. But he then became a friend of mine and a collaborator of mine and a coworker of mine, and remains a friend and collaborator and coworker of mine here 10 years later. And in fact now lives in Colorado and works with me at Great Scott Gadgets. And this kind of started a chain of events of people who are important to me in this community and who have had a strong and positive influence on me. For example, during that first ShmooCon that Dominic and I attended and spoke at, we met Hikari, who runs TourCon, and he was talking about Tour Camp and trying to get people to come to Tour Camp, which was the first American hacker camp that was happening later that summer. Dominic and I were both very interested in that, and so we made plans to go. And when I looked online at the wiki for Tour Camp, I was wondering, well, it looks like there are all these little sub-camps being created within Tour Camp, and it would be a good idea probably to join with one of these groups and see if we can camp with them, so we're not entirely on our own in this foreign world, foreign to us. And I started looking through the wiki and the various camps that were being organized, and I found this group of people that were coming from Portland, Oregon. And on their wiki page, they mentioned the talk that Dominic and I had volunteered to give at Tour Camp. And somebody from the Portland group, who turned out to be Jared Boone, had specifically posted on the wiki that among the interests of this group was this talk that Dominic and I were going to give. And I thought, well, great, if those are people who are interested in our work, then we're probably going to be interested in what they do too. So let's try to join with them. And so Dominic and I camped with the Dorkbot Portland folks and made wonderful friends who continue to be friends and collaborators to this day, including Jared Boone, who was later my co-designer of HackRF, and who really mentored me as I learned electronics through the Ubertooth project and the HackRF project. Another person I met at tour camp that year was Sergey Bratis. Now, Dominic and I volunteered to give a software-defined radio workshop at tour camp because we thought that software-defined radio was a very important technology and a very important set of skills that people in the hacker community could use to do things like wireless communication security research. And so, and I had even, before I met Dominic, been working on trying to find ways to teach hackers how to use this technology. And so we tried to do this workshop, but it didn't go particularly well because it was in the desert and we had very little power and there was a lot of dust storms and it was very hot and it just was not a very good environment for this. But we had a little bit of success. We found ways to explain software-defined radio that I think helped the hackers who were able to attend to understand some things that they didn't understand before. And one of those hackers who attended was Sergey Bratis. He only was able to attend a small portion of our workshop, but he liked what he saw. And later, that summer, I think I was at DEF CON, and I randomly ran into Sergey at like 2 a.m. in somebody's hotel room as we were at a party. And Sergey starts talking to me, and I realize what an interesting person he is. And I didn't really know who he was at the time. I didn't realize the great impact that he would have on the community and on me going forward. I didn't know that he and Meredith Patterson would later influence me so much with their work on LangSec, for example. But he was a very important person to me, or became a very important person to me, and one of the things that happened that night at DEF CON was that he convinced me that I should try again, that I should keep teaching software-defined radio. He said, if you find a place to teach your software-defined radio class, I will come and I will bring more students, because I think this is important. And we happened to be having this conversation near Hikari, who runs TourCon, and Hikari said, why don't you come to San Diego and teach your class there? And I said, okay. And so I went to San Diego and I taught a software-defined radio class that actually went pretty well and was in a much better environment for it. And Sergey came and he brought students, and I had a few other students. And for the first time, my software-defined radio training really took form. And that was at TourCon. I just last month taught at TourCon again for my 10th time. For my 10th year in a row, I've taught a software-defined radio class there. And since then, I've taught at many other locations, including events like Troopers in Germany or Black Hat USA. And I really realized this vision of how to teach software-defined radio to other people in the community, thanks to Sergey convincing me that it was valuable and convincing me that that was something that I could contribute. And as I contributed more and more, and I spoke more and taught more and built more and more tools and produced open source software and open source hardware, the more contributions I made, the more I felt a part of the community, and the more I felt the community was giving back to me. Now, Troopers Because one of the places I started teaching SDR classes not too long after TourCon, and Troopers has been a very important part of my joining the hacker community, partly because it's been the primary conference that I've attended in Europe. And so it's given me the opportunity to meet so many people on a new continent and learn and understand how much we have in common with one another across or on either side of this ocean. There are people that I've met through Troopers who've had an extremely significant impact on my life. There are important people here today I met through Troopers. Some of the folks I met in my earlier Troopers include Marion and Rodrigo, whom you'll hear from later today, and Nikki. And specifically, some of you know Nikki Vonderwell. Nikki, I remember this very specific kindness that she showed me the first time I met her. I met her at my first Troopers, and I later learned that this was her first Troopers too. But I met her one night at a dinner, and then the next night there was a party at this kind of fancy place, this bar that served champagne, and people were dressed very nicely, and I showed up with a bunch of hackers, and I was wearing a lab coat, and I looked kind of ridiculous, but thanks to the folks at Untitled Chapter, the hacker space nearby, who embroidered my company logo on a lab coat for me, I showed up with all these hackers, and the woman at the door of the bar did not want to let us in, even though this was where our party was supposed to be. And there had been some miscommunication, and we were having trouble getting in the door. And Nikki looked outside the window from this place and saw us, and she walked out that door, walked right up to me, just grabbed my arm. She barely knew me. She just grabbed my arm and said, "He's with me," and started to walk me in the door. That didn't work, but she tried. She tried, and I was just so taken aback that she showed me that kindness and our whole group that kindness. I suspect that the reason she singled me out was because I was the one who looked so ridiculous in a lab coat. And she thought, well, if they let him in, they'll let all the rest of them in. But as it turned out, she or somebody then talked to the staff inside, and they cleared up the confusion and got us into the place. But I will never forget that kindness that she showed me. And I had no idea that years later, I would get to know her not only as a friend, but as an incredible business consultant who has helped me run my business in another country. Another thing that happened from starting this SDR class, the software-defined radio class in TourCon, is that I met a lot of people through TourCon, and I was just looking recently at the schedule of talks from that first TourCon that I went to 10 years ago, and realized that there was not just one, not two, but about 5 or 6 talks given that year that significantly influenced me. Sergey gave a talk, for example. There was a talk given by Kei Chen about how he was able to manipulate the Apple firmware update process for USB keyboards and install malicious firmware on keyboards. And it wasn't long after that I said, oh, I could probably hijack a Bluetooth connection and do the exact same thing and install malicious firmware on an Apple Bluetooth keyboard, which did in fact work and which I later presented at ShmooCon. Something that was finally fixed years later after Mike Ryan worked with Apple on the issue. There was a talk given that year by Amanda Wozniak and some of the other folks from the Ninja Networks crowd. And those of you who have been to DEF CON or were at DEF CON many years ago may recall the sort of legendary ninja parties, and which got bigger and bigger and had more elaborate badges for entry, and they were giving a talk about how they had created an electronic badge just for the Ninja Networks party. And I was so inspired by Amanda and how she had taken on this amazing electrical engineering project just for fun, just for a party. She was one of the people who really inspired me to learn electronics and inspired me to pursue building tools for fun, along with Travis Goodspeed and Joe Grand. She was one of the people who really inspired me in that area. Also, through my early days at TourCon, I met Mike Ryan. Now, this was maybe my third TourCon. I designed, again, partly inspired by Woz, I designed a badge, an electronic badge for TourCon. And this was based on my Ubertooth project. And my Ubertooth was and still is, a Bluetooth sniffer, a Bluetooth monitoring tool. And I created a badge for TourCon that year that we wanted to kind of make it an Ubertooth, but that was difficult to do within our budget. So I made it a low-cost 2.4 gigahertz spectrum analyzer with a row of LEDs that would indicate radio activity in the 2.4 gigahertz band. And I created a way to adapt it, to make it into an Ubertooth, but it took a bunch of work to do that. Well, Mike Ryan was somebody who was interested in this badge of mine and the Easter egg that I had hidden in it. And he was trying to figure out what the Easter egg was and how to find it and how to activate it. And here he was reverse engineering code from a microcontroller architecture. It was a CPU architecture that he had never seen before, and he had no tools to work with. And he just started delving into it and figuring it out. And he actually found the Easter egg and how to activate it. And so he won my Easter egg contest. And as a prize, I gave him a fully populated badge that had been turned into an Ubertooth. And that was his first Ubertooth. And he said, wow, this is interesting. I could start looking at some Bluetooth stuff with this. And months later, he and Dominic Spill and I were chatting, and we found that he was still interested in doing something with Bluetooth, and he was asking us for advice. What would be a good Bluetooth project that he could do with his Ubertooth? And we looked at each other, and we looked at him, and we said, well, nobody's really looked at Bluetooth low energy yet. It's a new Bluetooth standard that, it has been specified, but hardware isn't really shipping yet, but it will be soon, and it's maybe the way of the future of Bluetooth, and nobody's really analyzed the security of it. And Mike said, okay, I'll look at that. And he started analyzing the security of Bluetooth low energy and started contributing to the Ubertooth project, making software and firmware that allowed us to monitor and manipulate Bluetooth low energy systems. And today, Mike Ryan is arguably the world's leading expert on Bluetooth low energy security. And that happened because he won a contest at a con and got a tool as a prize and was just interested in hacking. And he has contributed so much back to the community. He's contributed to my open source project. He's contributed to the knowledge throughout the community of how Bluetooth low energy works and what its security characteristics are. Later, I created HackRF, which is a software-defined radio platform, and I wouldn't have been able to do it if I hadn't had these experiences and been inspired by all of these people that I met, people like Woz and people like Jared Boone and people like Sergey and Dominic and Mike Ryan. And one of my favorite memories of HackRF is that it was when it was adapted a few years ago at the Chaos communication camp, right? The CCC camp in Germany. It was adapted by the Munich CCC group into the radio badge. Here, my open source software-defined radio project was taken by other people and turned into something that could be given away to 5,000 people camping in a field. It was amazing. One of my favorite experiences. And hacker camps are among my very most favorite events, partly because they have such interesting projects. The radio badge is one of many. Partly because they're very inclusive. When you go and camp with a lot of hackers in a field, you're kind of a part of everything all at once, and you get to hang out with everyone all at once. And partly because they're so diverse and creative. There are so many interesting projects. One of my favorites was the Church of Robotron, which was this amazing art project at Tour Camp in the US that was done by that same group of friends of mine from Portland that I met at the first tour camp. At a later tour camp, they decided to create an art project that was based on the 1982 arcade game, Robotron 2084. This classic arcade game was about how the Robotrons eliminate humans in the year 2084. And you are the mutant savior. You, due to a genetic engineering error, are the last hope of mankind and must defeat the Robotrons and save the last human family. And the Church of Robotron takes that to be prophecy and seeks out the future mutant savior who will save mankind in the year 2084. It was a fantastic art project with incredible technological elements and has influenced me to this day. I still consider myself a member of the Church of Robotron, and the one arcade game that I actually own is Robotron 2084 because of these wonderful creative weirdness that I found through hacker camps. I am overwhelmed by the support that I feel from the hacker community, and I continue to feel through the years. One of the things that keeps me coming to hacker events and really makes me happy to be a part of this community is how people in this community support each other, and how they, in my case, how they support me simply by saying thank you from time to time for things that I've done, simply by telling me how they've used my tools or my training to do interesting and exciting things. I cannot stress enough how much I appreciate the open source contributions of this community, not just contributions to my own open source projects, but to any open source projects. Open source hardware and open source software, I think, are important to this community and are especially important to me. And this community supports me by just buying stuff that I make. The reason I'm able to have an open source hardware company and employ people and do cool stuff is because there are people in the community who value what we do and who buy the tools that we create. And more lately, I've realized how important it is that I have the support of the community as far as health and wellness. I've had difficulties with my physical health and my mental health, and it has largely been people in this community who, whether they know it or not, are the people who have given me the support that I need. I felt a part of the community finally when I realized that I could contribute to the community. The more I contributed, the more I tried to change the community, for example, by saying to myself, I think hackers need to know software-defined radio. I'm going to go try to teach hackers software-defined radio. That was a change I wanted to see in the community. When I decided to try to change the community by contributing educational materials, by contributing content, by creating open source tools and giving them to the community, that's when I started feeling that I was getting something back from the community. And that's when I started feeling a part of the community. And so I want to encourage all of you to find the ways that you can contribute. Now, some of you maybe could contribute by standing up here and giving a talk, or doing research and publishing it, or creating open source tools and publishing them. Some of you may be terrified by the idea of standing up here, and that's okay. There are many other ways you can contribute. For example, at a conference such as this, most conferences in the hacker community are largely run by volunteers. There are wonderful opportunities to volunteer and help out. And if you volunteer and you help run an event like this, you will meet so many wonderful people and you'll feel more of a part of the community, in my opinion. There are so many different jobs you could do. Running the registration desk is a lot of work. It requires some very important volunteers. Speaker operations, just helping to make sure that speakers get to the stage and show up and get the support that they need. Artwork. Conferences need artwork. There are all kinds of different jobs that people can do to help out at a conference. You can help out and support the community by contributing open source software or by contributing documentation to open source projects. You can help out the community in all sorts of different ways that you may not have even thought about in the past, but if you look and see how other people help the community, you may be inspired by how you could do that yourself. And this is a unique opportunity here that you have the next couple of days. There are so many wonderful people here today, and this is a great opportunity for you to meet them. One of the best things that you can do to feel a part of the community is just to say hi to someone. And I encourage you to look around and see if there's something that you could help to improve in the community. Now, personally, I can say that I've found many wonderful aspects of the community, but there are some negative aspects of the community too, and I try not to dwell on them too much. I try to be an optimist. I try to look for the good things. But as an example, one of the things that I think is a negative in the community is that we don't have enough women who are active in the community. And you can look around the room and see, there just aren't that many of you who are sitting near a woman. And if you look at the list of speakers for this conference, you'll notice there are only a couple of women. And Eva and Thais are wonderful, intelligent, inspiring people, but there are only 2 out of 30-some. And I think that's a problem. I think that's something that we could change as a community. We could help improve. And what are the ways that we can do that? And this is just one example of one of the things you might try to change in the community. It's easy to look at the conference, for example, and say, well, they should do a better job of recruiting women speakers. And maybe that's true, but I think blaming the conference is not necessarily the most helpful thing, because it's a symptom of a problem that affects the whole community, not just the conference. Maybe some of you know women who would like to be here but aren't. Did you invite them to come with you to the conference? Maybe you could. Maybe some of you know women who really should be up here speaking. Do you know if they applied to the conference? Did they submit an idea for a talk? Maybe they should have, and maybe they just needed a little encouragement to do that. There are a lot of things that we can do to help women become a more active part of this community, to feel more welcome in this community. And that's just one little example of one thing that I think we could improve in the community, and a few ideas for how we might do small things to improve the community in that way. And maybe that's an aspect of the community that you'd like to improve, or maybe there are other aspects of the community that you'd like to improve or you'd like to see better. And if you can find one little thing that you can do to try to make the community more like you would like to see the community, then I think, like me, you will find that you feel more a part of the community, and that as you give and help improve the community, you will get back even more than you give, and you will feel, like I do, the rewards of being a part of this wonderful group of people. I hope that you have a wonderful time here at Hacktivity, and I hope I get to know many of you. Thank you all for being a part of this community, whether you know it at all, whether you know it or not. And thanks for listening.